So I work mainly at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology in Oshawa. I'm a professor in energy systems, and I look at largely energy provision, but then also how flooding and risk manifests within the energy sector. So I guess it goes back to 1987 when I bought a copy of Our Common Future at the Bookshelf Cafe in Guelph. I gave my first talk on climate change when I worked for the city of Guelph in 1988 at the Arboretum. And we knew then pretty well what we know now, that things are changing. And back then we said, oh, they're going to change really quickly. And 30 years later, we're seeing that they are really changing quickly. And since then, I've worked for the government of Bermuda in the engineering and works department. I was part of solid waste as well as hurricane response group. And then I worked almost 20 years for the World Bank in sustainable cities. And urban resilience and flood protection is all a key part of urban sustainability. Well, I guess every city is unique. We do the same dumb things that they do in every city. So for example, the flooding in Calgary and then the houses being rebuilt on floodplains, that happens everywhere. We have fewer coastal cities that a lot of countries have. So that's really an issue in the Halifax, and maybe a little bit in Vancouver and Victoria are our coastal challenges there, Burnaby. Whereas cities like Jakarta are in dire straits with regards to climate change and flooding. So too Lagos. There's Cairo is another one. There's a whole list of cities that are worse off than us, but that doesn't help the Canadian person in Calgary when their basement's been flooded or whatever. So it's an issue everywhere, in every city pretty well. So one of the things we're looking at, and at first you think, well, it doesn't really make any, there's not much of a connection, but we're looking at rolling out electric vehicles and ride sharing in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So trying to knit together all of the communities in Southern Ontario, and there's enormous potential. And then you start looking at it and you think, well, wait a second, if we have a lot more electric vehicles, we have a lot more ride sharing, how much do we increase our risk to flooding? And we find that it's actually significant. So when we start looking at all of these new transportation plans, we have to be very careful that we're not increasing our vulnerabilities, which is actually a trade-off in many cases. So we were just chatting before we started about getting a house renovated and going to a contractor and saying, hey, I really want a backwater flow valve, these sorts of things, and the contractor going, I'm not exactly sure what you want. It's going to take a little while yet, I think, for some of these things to become commonplace for the average contractor or the new home builder or renovator. That will take some time. I think there'll also be challenges or the need for the insurance industry to sort of push their customers that, hey, if you do this, this, and this, we can give you a better deal. We see that now. A lot more of the insurance companies are offering overland flood insurance. But then they often say, well, but hang on a second, you live in an area that isn't exactly a place that we want to insure, and then you start thinking about, when you build a new house, these sorts of things. And I think it will take 5 to 10 years probably for it to sort of filter out throughout society, but we're getting there. Well, nothing's a better teacher than actually something happening. So for example, in Thunder Bay, there was significant flooding. And the city of Thunder Bay has a lawsuit in place, people suing them saying, hey, you didn't do enough as a city. So pretty well every municipality in Canada now kind of has a bit of the fear of God in them that, hey, are we doing enough to make sure that we're addressing this issue? And I think over time that just becomes more and more of a mindset that whether you're a municipality, whether you're a home builder, whether you're an insurance company, you have to start thinking about, am I really addressing not yesterday's climate, because yesterday's climate is not likely what we're going to be facing tomorrow, but we're really in a new normal, and we'll see it most severely in floods. They're the ones that cost the most. And then after that, it'll probably be fire. So again, it's one of those things that at first you think, well, there's not that much of a connection, because DSSA really looks after fuels, elevating devices, escalators, and amusement devices. So Canada's Wonderland and the X, ski lifts, operating engineers, and boilers and pressure vessels. But when you start looking at them more closely and you realize, hey, hang on a second, we have a boiler that's in an area that's prone for flooding, that becomes an issue. Or just a couple of weeks ago, we had 2 guys trapped in the elevator as the water starts flowing in while they're in the basement. That's not immediately an elevator safety issue, but it becomes a flooding issue, and it's all connected. So again, we're in a kind of a new normal. And it's starting to affect everything, whether it's regulations and safety provision of elevators or escalators. We have a lot of escalators that go into the basement. So what happens when the basement is flooded? We have a lot of fuel facilities that could be susceptible to flooding. So a lot of these things we have to start sort of rethinking that, are we doing enough to watch out for potential flooding? Probably I would say the first and most important thing is to have a bit of an attitudinal shift. So most of us have a car, and we know that we have to change the oil every now and then the car will last longer and we'll get more when we sell the car, or we have to make sure the brakes are maintained. So we have this habit in our minds that a car needs to be maintained. But we haven't always made that leap for our homes. So we have a furnace. You've got to change the filter, and a lot of people don't do it. You've got to maintain it. We have fuel burning devices that we don't maintain. We have dirt, where we're not worrying about how well the lot is leveled around our house. Just simple maintenance things, cutting limbs off of trees that are too close, or making sure that the catch basins nearby are clean, these sorts of things. And just getting a mindset that that really an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure kind of thing. And thinking about maintaining our homes, not just for flooding, but for fires and all sorts of things. But so you get a lot of benefit by a relatively small input worth of work. So yeah, sustainability and risk management to a large extent, I would argue, is doing what you can do so the bill is less for your kids or your grandkids, or the person who buys your house down the road, or the person who might just be coming after you, or even yourself in a year or two. There's a lot of things you can do to increase sustainability and reduce risk. Maintaining your home, worrying about climate change. I mean, it's here. It's one of these things that's a global phenomenon, but it's having local impacts, whether it's flooding or fires, forest fires. We have to be a lot more honest with ourselves, I think, both as individuals and as well as as a society. I bet you that I bought the book in 1987, and since 1987 we've kind of been going, oh, everybody really, climate change is here, it's here, it's here. And yeah, but now it's really here. I mean, those 30 years, we've kind of frittered them away, and now we've got kind of to pay the piper. So it's a big deal, and there's a lot of things that we're going to have to do, but it's kind of the sooner you start, the better. And some of them are, it's sort of a little, big approach, that you start doing the little things, like a backwater flow valve in your house, or changing the furnace filter, or making sure that your lot is graded so that the water can run away from the home, these sorts of things. Knowing that if you actually live on a floodplain, that's a pretty easy thing to go online and say, okay, where do I live? What are the issues? Knowing what city you live in, so that depending on the city, are you in downtown Guelph near the Speed River? Are you in Peterborough where there's been flooding? All these sorts of things. It's not that difficult to get yourself aware quickly, and probably along with this course, probably the best thing is to hire somebody when you're doing as a home inspection who has the big picture in mind and isn't there to say you need to do this, and this, but much more, hey, if you do this relatively little thing, the potential benefit is enormous. So it's a bit of a good news story, and despite sort of that we've left it a bit late. So probably in Ontario we have the 72 hours Are You OK? To try and make sure that every homeowner, if they needed, could be self-sufficient for 72 hours. Do you have enough food at home? Do you have enough medicine, etc.? Could you be okay for 72 hours without help from anybody else? That's probably number one. Number two is, an ounce of prevention. Do you have a flashlight with batteries? If you have a generator, do you know to make sure not to turn it on inside the garage and have carbon monoxide and these sorts of things? Have you put those sort of thought processes in place? There's a fascinating thing that happens with humans that every now and then we see, and floods are one of these things that can bring out the best and the worst in people. So we've seen it in New Orleans. I used to work in Bermuda, and we got hit by a couple hurricanes when I was there. And there's always sort of, there's union challenges and this and that, and things are very difficult sometimes in Bermuda. But we got hit by a hurricane, and everybody cooperated. So if there is a flood event, there's a lot that you can do simply by having a good attitude in terms of getting through it. Nobody's having fun when this happens, but there's a lot that can be done that can reduce the impact. And again, sort of being as prepared as possible as an individual and as a homeowner, so that you're not the one who's causing stress on the emergency response team. And also, increasingly, we're finding, think about your pets. Because in New Orleans, this was a big issue. What am I going to do with all my pets? And British Columbia, the fires right now, it's these sorts of things. So just planning it out in relatively simple detail, but being ready, I guess, is the main point. Yeah, that's a big topic. So right now the world is very interconnected. So my cable TV is available, the internet is available, my electricity is available through fairly large systems, service provision systems. And it tends to be, well, especially in Ontario, they're generally very reliable. But when they go, they can go in a large cascading failure approach. So for example, it was just 15 years ago, a couple weeks ago, was the anniversary of the blackout in Ontario. Well, the whole eastern seaboard. And when it goes, it really goes. And then what happens is you almost have a shelter-in-place mindset. So instead of being able to rely on getting in your car and driving somewhere, you find that there may not be any gas, the roads may not be passable, these sorts of things. So you keep sort of retrenching and having a smaller and smaller area that you have to cope within. So this is particularly important in cities, whether it's a dense city like Toronto or Montreal or Jakarta or whatever. But if some major flood event happens, more and more what ends up typically happening is that for the first 24, 48 hours, you want to be able to be on your own with a group of neighbors and this sort of thing. So it sounds maybe more complicated, but it's things like making sure you know if somebody lives alone next door, if somebody's in a wheelchair, has a disability somewhere nearby, that you check in on them every now and then. It's sort of figuring out how to kind of one for all and all for one kind of thing, and having a good comfort level with your neighbors, not just because it makes life easier, which it does, but it does make life much easier when something happens, whether it's a flood or any kind of an emergency. So that's generally it. And more, probably with large-scale climate change impacts, cities and parts of cities may need to be able to rely on themselves for longer periods of time than they're traditionally used to. So that's making sure there's enough fuel in the tanks for water pumping and these sorts of things. And most cities are looking at that, and emergency response measures, they tend to have that. You know, how long can we be on our own, basically. Well, I guess actually the first, it's a bit of a cop-out, I suppose, but really the first is conservation. So the less energy that you actually need, the better, because then you're less of a demand on the system, and then whatever backup supply you have, there's less of a requirement. And it probably varies by location. Out in the more rural areas, they may have backup diesel generators, backup gasoline generators, battery, or simply, you know, it's things like trying never to have the tank of gas in your car be lower than half a tank. These sorts of things make a big difference especially in the rural areas. In more urban areas, we're seeing a lot of people install backup natural gas generators, which I'm not so sure. And there's good and bad with that. One of the things that we're seeing that's, I think, really interesting and hasn't been pitched enough, I think, is this whole movement to electric vehicles. In the ice storm a couple of years ago here in Toronto, and it was in Markham, there was a guy who just plugged in his Prius. It was all fully charged before the ice storm, and he had, I think it was 36 hours worth of electricity from the battery of his car. So if you're going to build a new home, wire it in so that you can plug in your electric vehicle if you have it. So I guess it depends. We're seeing probably more hydrogen for heavy-duty trucks along the 400 series highways. Hydrogen is a good potential backup fuel simply because you can get a lot of power within a relatively small, dense container. Wind, solar, they're all great backups. We have hydro is a really good. I mean, Quebec has, I think, 3 years worth of backup hydro supply behind the reservoirs. So it's a bit of everything in terms of supply, but mostly, as much as possible, it's reducing demand. So we, yeah, sadly, we live in a semi here in Toronto. We woke up one morning and it wasn't raining or anything, but we had this big flood in our basement. We couldn't figure out what was going on, and was it a backup of the sewer? And we looked, and I thought, no, the water's pretty clean. And anyways, our neighbors, they were on holiday, and we called a plumber, and they came and they couldn't figure it out. We called the city, and they had turned off our water, and it was still happening. Anyways, it turned out to be that our neighbors had accidentally left their toilet running, so it overflowed with clean water, but then it went down into the basement, came into our side of the foundation. We had some places 18 inches of water. And the thing that we learned in a hurry was, again, little, big, big. So first, if we had known that we had a backflow valve on our sewer, we would have known that, okay, wait, it can't be our sewer. We didn't think it was. If we had known about we didn't even know where to turn our water off. The city came and they didn't know, and they had to dig up we had a guy who came in who was going to dig up our whole sidewalk because we couldn't figure out what it was. So it's just, making sure that you don't have your most prized possessions, which I did, which was really stupid, in the basement, and they were flooded. So, and you learn that stuff pretty quickly. I suppose it moves and you might forget them, but I'm not so sure. The stuff that I really care about is no longer in the basement. Oh, for sure. I think, it ended up being one of those sort of bitter lessons that, again, an ounce of prevention is a whole lot of cure, in the sense that if you're ready for these sorts of things, you can really reduce the impact. In terms of our basement, the renovation includes, we now know we have a backflow valve, we have, sump pump with backup supply, et cetera, yeah. Yeah, perhaps not personally in terms of our specific house, that sort of thing. I'm definitely aware of how quick a flood event can happen, and how you can go from this sort of maybe a bucolic, oh, life is great, and then all of a sudden, once you look down the stairs in your basement and you see the flood, things change very fast. I'm also, maybe it's part of my job, but we in Canada are still very lucky compared to the rest of the world. There's a lot of cities that are in much, much worse condition than our Canadian cities. And they're getting hit over and over and over with flood events that I know is going to have an impact on, already is, in terms of environmental refugees and economies of those countries and what ends up happening. And those are the sorts of things that flooding becomes a really important geopolitical issue from here on in, I think. No, touch wood, not yet. No. I guess first would be, there's not really any need to scare homeowners or to try and terrify them. There's things that homeowners can do that are just smart, common sense things to improve their home that reduce their odds of significant impact significantly. So it's being aware of those and being able to communicate them to the homeowner. And part of being the home inspector with the sort of the flood background is that Now you're really knowledgeable in one area, and the challenge is communicating that in a way that homeowners don't feel overwhelmed, or they don't dismiss it and say, well, this is a joke, but that you show them a simple path of how to implement most of your recommendations, with a stepwise, you need to buy this, or you need to install this, or you should call this company and they can do it in a couple weeks, it's usually this much money, those sorts of things. And not to overwhelm them with the horrors of the potential flood, but to sort of, it's a little bit like the dentist and sort of having people clean their teeth. You get to keep your teeth a lot longer. It's kind of the same thing with your home. If you manage it and worry about flooding and maintenance, these sorts of things, it's a whole lot easier than if you don't.